Hello Fleet, and welcome back to another episode in the Know Your Ship series. Today's episode will be on the Italian battleships of the Andrea Doria class, which the Italians referred to as the Caio Duilio class. As always, before I begin any episode, I start with some news. Rumor has it that there might be some kind of announcement occurring for World of Warships at the end of the month. Don't quote me here, but it might be a good time to start paying attention to the forums. Also, quite recently, I've been selected to be a World of Warships super tester, and I promise that I'll be doing my absolute best to help in the development of the game so that all of you will get something truly awesome at release. Furthermore, for some of you who aren't aware of it, the 5K subscriber giveaway contest is currently running. To enter, the link is in the description below. It'll run until I think February the 26th, 2015 at 23:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And finally, don't forget to like me on Facebook. The link for my Facebook group is in the description below. Now, back onto ships. The Andrea Doria class comprised the two battleships, the Andrea Doria and the Caio Duilio. They were authorized and ordered in 1911 in order to address the numerical inferiority of the Italian fleet when compared to the French fleet. The Caio Duilio was completed in May of 1915 and the Andrea Doria in June of 1916. This class of battleship was in many respects similar to the preceding Cavour-class battleships. They mounted the same main armament, which consisted of 13 12-inch guns mounted in a 3-2-3-2-3 layout. The main difference between the Andrea Doria class and the Cavour class lay in the secondary armament, which the Andrea Doria class had a much more powerful 6-inch gun. The Andrea Doria class had 16 single 6-inch guns mounted in casements and 19 3-inch guns that could be placed in 34 different mounting points. Initially, the battleships were equipped with submerged 17.7-inch torpedo tubes, but these would later be removed. Fire control-wise, the Andrea Doria class ships were equipped with a license-built British bar and strout system. Range was figured optically with the aid of a fire control computer. To explain this in even greater detail, the fire control data would be sent to the plotting room, which accounted for 5 different factors: range and bearing of the target, target course, target speed, and the range rate. The Andrea Doria class ships would never be equipped with radar, and were thus always restricted to their optical range-finding systems, a limitation that saw the Italian fleet operate mostly during clear, calm days and never at night. Armor-wise, though, these ships weren't all that amazing. They had a main belt armor of 250 millimeters or 9.8 inches, with 280 millimeters or 11 inches of armor for the turrets. The battleships of this class originally had a mixed oil-coal firing system that managed to produce 32,000 shaft horsepower, which pushed the ships to a top speed of 21.5 knots. During World War I, these ships did not engage in any notable actions. Their primary opponent at the time was the Austro-Hungarian Navy, which spent the majority of the war in port. The Italian Navy basically just blockaded the Austro-Hungarian Navy's ports, and nothing really happened. Things begin to get a little bit more interesting in 1937, when both the Caio Duilio and the Andrea Doria were taken out of service to undergo some pretty intensive modernizations. This modernization can almost be described as a complete rebuilding of the ships, since when it was done, only 40% of the original ship remained, the greatest modernization done by any navy during the interwar period. The amidships gun turret was removed, as was all secondary and anti-aircraft guns. Even the original superstructure of the ship was removed. The most notable improvements to the Andrea Doria class lay in the armor protection improvements. Deck armor was significantly increased from a pitiful 24 mm with 40 mm slopes in the original build to a much more significant 80 mm with 100 mm over the magazines. Interestingly enough though, I have seen some figures quoting the deck armor as being 98 mm to anything in the range of 135 mm of deck armor. Now, I personally favor the 80mm with 100mm over the magazine figure because of a few factors. First, even after the modernizations, the Andrea Doria class battleships were not protected against British 15-inch shells. The figure of 135mm of deck armor would have given the Andrea Dorias close to 5.3 inches of deck armor, which is even heavier deck armor than the Queen Elizabeth class battleships. Now, following typical battleship design philosophy, the armor on a ship should protect the ship against its own shells. One can then hypothesize that the Queen Elizabeth class battleships would have been protected against their own 15-inch shells. With that kind of armor, though, the Andrea Dorias would have been protected against the Queen Elizabeth's 15-inch fire, which was not true. The 98mm figure, which is the most commonly found number on Wikipedia, is an acceptable figure. I personally don't think the Andrea Doria had that much deck armor due to a sort of a more sideways reason than most of you would think, and that was because the Andrea Dorias had to carry more weight in their secondary armaments. Now, this occurred because Italy, unlike Great Britain and the United States, could not produce a working dual-purpose gun. This led to the Italians having to use up more of their ship's displacement in order to accommodate a dedicated anti-aircraft battery as well as an actual secondary battery. If one looks at the modernized Andrea Dorias, the ship carried 2 rows of anti-aircraft guns as well as 4 triple 5.3-inch guns. These additional guns used up a lot of valuable displacement, which leads me to be more accepting of the lower 80mm with 100mm over the magazine figure. Torpedo protection was also improved with the addition of the Pugliese system. I have to admit that this was indeed a very interesting torpedo protection system, and so I wanted to go into a bit of depth about the system. A lot of countries at the time simply opted to add torpedo bulges to their ships. While that is a perfectly valid method of protection, torpedo bulges did slow the ship down, and also at times affected their stability. Hence why many later ship designs came designed with internal protection systems. The Andrea Dorias were equipped with a system that was very ingenious, if somewhat flawed in practice. The Pugliese system was invented by Umberto Pugliese, and was meant as an energy-absorbing form of passive protection. The system provided specially designed structures that were specifically designed to absorb, via pre-calculated hydrodynamic and mechanical effects, the majority of the energy of an underwater explosion. The system worked along these lines. When a torpedo hit the torpedo protection system, it would transfer the force of the explosion into the internal hull bulge. The kinetic energy would then be bouncing around the internal hull bulge, looking for a way to escape. This escape was provided in the form of an empty cylinder, which was meant to be crushed by the kinetic energy. Once the cylinder was crushed, it significantly reduced the amount of energy that could cause damage to the inner bulkhead. The problem with the system, however, was that the cylinders were supported by a series of concave holding bulkheads, and when the torpedoes hit, the kinetic force tended to damage these supporting structures instead of the cylinders themselves, and thereby caused a lot of damage to the ships that were supposed to be protected by this system. With the removal of the amidships turret, the total number of guns fell to 10. These were arranged in a 3-2-2-3 configuration. The loss of the amidships turret was compensated by reboring the guns to a larger 12.59-inch caliber. This allowed the ship to fire a heavier shell with better penetrating power than the old 12-inch guns. The 12.59-inch guns had a maximum elevation of 27 degrees, and it could fire a 1,155-pound shell to a maximum distance of 31,280 yards. The guns were capable of firing 2 rounds a minute. However, the rebored guns did pose certain problems that were never fully rectified. One of the problems was that the reboring of the guns reduced longitudinal resistance to barrel droop, and thereby increased the dispersion of the shots. The second problem was that the Italian guns had a very, very short barrel life of only 150 rounds. And then when you take that and you compare it to the close to 335 round life of the British 15-inch guns and the 290 to 350 rounds that the Iowas had, really illustrates the deficiency with the Italian main guns. The modernized Andrea Dorias also had their original 20-boiler 4-shaft system removed and was replaced instead with an 8-boiler 2-shaft configuration. This allowed the ship to develop about 75,000 shaft horsepower, which increased the ship's top speed to 27 knots. The ship's performance was also increased with the addition of a new bow, which in my personal opinion is what made these ships so awesomely beautiful to look at. Operationally speaking, in World War II, these battleships didn't have the longest careers. Even though the Italian Navy was more ready for war than any other branches of the Italian armed forces, the timing was a little off, and it caught them by surprise. You see, at the start of Italy's involvement in World War II, only the 2 modernized Cavour-class battleships were actually ready to go. The Andrea Dorias were still being refitted, and the new Littorio Venetos were still months away from being combat ready. The refitting of the Caio Duilio was done in April of 1940, and the Andrea Doria in October of 1940. Both ships were present in Toronto when the British attacked in November of the same year. The Andrea Doria was not hit, but the Duilio was hit by a swordfish torpedo and was beached to prevent her from sinking. After temporary repairs, she would be taken to Genoa for more permanent repairs, which would last all the way until May of 1941. During this time, though, the Andrea Doria did take part in several operations that were intended to catch British convoys. By the end of 1941, both the Caio Duilio and the Andrea Doria were tasked with escorting convoys from Italy to North Africa. Convoy work for both ships, however, only lasted until early 1942, where, due to a pretty severe fuel shortage, both battleships were kept in port until Italy's capitulation in 1943. In 1944, the Allies did allow both ships to return to Italian ports, and at the end of the war, Italy was allowed to keep both ships, which then served as fleet flagships at different times. In 1953, both ships were removed from service, and the Andrea Doria served as a gunnery training ship, while the Duilio was put into reserve. Both ships were struck from the Naval Register in 1956 and scrapped. Looking at their short operational careers, it can be reasonably argued that the modernization of these particular Italian battleships was a major waste of Italy's limited naval shipbuilding capacities, which could have been dedicated to many smaller but equally important warships. And that's all, folks. Hope you all enjoyed this episode on the Andrea Doria class battleships. I know many of you are eagerly awaiting these episodes, and I will do my absolute best to get them out as fast as possible. But a lot of these more recent episodes have taken longer since I'm now almost completely dependent upon my own research, as many of these ships are never covered in any kind of documentary. So, if you do like what I'm doing, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. And aside from all that, I hope you have an awesome week, and I'll see you all on the high seas soon.